I had never met the guy before that night. What my friends and I did was extremely foolish. Given the crowd we rolled with, it was fortunate that we didn't end up as ghosts ourselves. I was part of the goth scene in high school. These were the prime years of Hot Topic fashion, where every town had a garage band that played scene music, and every school had a little collection of black-clad figures who smoked out behind the gym. I was a poster child for goth culture. Eyeliner, hair like an oversprayed raven wing, fishnets, combat boots, the whole 9 yards. The school hated our little clique, mostly due to truancy and the little pile of butts we left out behind the gym, but we didn't care. It was all part of the aesthetic, right? October may have meant costumes and candy when we were younger, but now that we were older, October was 30 days of celebration. On any given afternoon, my friends and I could wander downtown and hear someone telling spooky stories on the corner, take part in a ghost tour, or listen to someone playing a saw or something spooky with scavenged instruments. Downtown had a sizable artistic scene, and October was also their month to cash in on the semi-spooky history of the town. Pinkerton Dock, the park where some witches had been burned, the old gallows by the courthouse, the Rikers Hotel, they all had a history of ghosts and spooky occurrences. Sometimes, we would just walk around in our dark clothes and heavy makeup, adding to the ambience. So, when the posters appeared at our favorite coffee shop, Dark Brew, announcing a Halloween concert for the local band Burning Ramses, we all planned to be there. We were sitting towards the back, the air heavy with the smell of clove cigarettes and the fruity smell of smuggled vodka, when the man in the vest suddenly approached our table. I was sitting with Catherine and Margot, Tobias and Clyde sitting on the other side, and we had just started discussing what we would do after the concert. Clyde thought that we should go to the old Leaback place, the most haunted spot in town, and see if we could spot some ghosts. Margot wanted to go drinking at Pinehurst Cemetery, something that was a shock to no one. Margot was already 3 sheets to the wind and seemed to be destined for a life of barely functional alcoholism. Tobias was just suggesting that maybe we could check out the trail on the next town over where those kids had been murdered back in the 80s, when the guy seemed to appear between he and Catherine before speaking up. It wouldn't have been so strange. The place was packed, but Cat and Tobias were sitting against the back wall. If you guys are looking for something spooky to do, you should come out to Habersham Cemetery with me. We all jumped and looked at him, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. He was older than we were, somewhere between 20 and 30, wearing dark jeans and a leather vest covered in patches from shows he'd been to. I didn't recognize any of the patches, but I thought I recognized the man. I'd seen him at shows before, one of those guys who likes to hover around the back, and the left side of his head had a weird burn on it, like someone had pressed his face against a radiator. That side was hairless, and he had swooped the rest of his corn silk hair over it to hide the spot. It drew more attention to it, ruining the attempt to hide it, and the longer I looked at him, the more he looked like a skeleton someone had squeezed into scene kid clothes. Hearing him talk now was a little odd. I had expected his voice to be something like a hiss or carry a stutter. We would all be surprised later that we hadn't just told him to leave, which would stick with me. We had been enchanted by him, held by some kind of glamour, and when Tobias asked what he meant, it seemed like he had only been waiting for someone to ask. Habersham Cemetery is supposed to be as old as the town itself. It's lost in the woods near Terry Mill, and I watched a corpse dance there last year. I leaned in to hear, wanting him to go on, but he stood up and pointed at the door with his thumb. I could tell you all about it, but why tell you when I can show you? It happens at midnight on Halloween night, and if I want to see it, I need to get moving. You can come with me if you want. It's definitely something to see. He pushed past Catherine and headed for the door, clearly not caring if we followed him or not, and the 5 of us looked at each other in silent conference. It sounded fun, but none of us knew this guy. Clyde thought his name might be Steve, but he had never talked to him. Clyde was interested in seeing what was at the cemetery, and Tobias thought he had heard of the place before. It's supposed to be wild, like it feels like there might be real magic there, I heard. After a short discussion, it was unanimously decided that we would follow him out there. Catherine added that there were 5 of us, and even if he was a creep, he didn't look very intimidating. The man was a scarecrow, and 5 older teens could easily jump him if he decided to get weird. So after we roused Margot and got her shakily to her feet, we all set out after the weird guy before he could get too far ahead. He looked up when we walked out, enjoying a cigarette on the sidewalk, and his smile was broad and genuine. "Glad you guys decided to join me. Looks like I might need a ride." He pointed to an empty parking spot nearby and explained how his van had been towed while he was inside. "Guess my tags were a little more expired than I thought. Think I could catch a ride with you guys? I don't mind hitchhiking back if you don't want to come back with me." This elicited a new huddle. I had a Ford Focus that would be lucky to hold 4 people, and Kat and Margot had ridden with me. Luckily, Clyde had a Jeep and figured he could easily put all 6 of us in the vehicle. We decided that Tobias and Catherine would sit on either side of this guy in the back, just to make sure he didn't try anything weird. Tobias was a softie, but he was nearly 6 feet tall, and was muscled through the shoulders from working on his dad's farm all his life. Catherine was a waif by comparison, but the whole group had seen her put guys twice her size on their asses more than once, and we felt confident that the 2 of them could keep the guy from getting too crazy. Nodding, we broke and told him he could ride in the back, as long as he could give us directions. He introduced himself as Steve, and took his seat graciously before telling Clyde to hop on the main road and head out of town. We rode in silence past the town sign, the silence getting awkward until Tobias finally couldn't take it anymore. "So, I don't think I've ever been to Habersham Cemetery. What's the deal with it?" "Habersham Cemetery is beautiful, but it's been kinda lost to time," Steve explained. "It's owned by the old Habersham family, though they're all gone now. They were dancers. Did you know that? Their whole family was in the ballet or the theater, until one day their bloodline just kinda dwindled out. The old cemetery is really the only sign that they were ever here at all. When I was in school, my friends and I would go out there to hang out a lot. My friend Trevor had discovered it as a kid, and we used to get drunk and smoke there whenever we all got together. It sounds weird, but that's where I got my first kiss, where I took my first drink, and the place I have the happiest memories of." "Why aren't these friends going out there with you then?" asked Kat, her tone not really accusing, but more curious than anything. "Oh, they just don't really hang out with me anymore. People get older, they kinda drift apart. Life happens and people grow separate. You guys will figure that out one day." At the time, I remember thinking this wouldn't happen to us, but everyone knows how that usually works out. For the moment, we were on an adventure, and that was what was important. Steve bumped Clyde's headrest softly, pointing towards an access road as it swam into the headlights, and he told him to take it. "It's at the end of the access road. It should only take about 10 minutes to get there from here." I checked my watch and saw that it was pushing 11. We should make it in plenty of time, but I hope this wasn't just a creative means to lure us out into the woods. This guy seemed at ease as he sat between Catherine and Tobias, but some people could turn on a dime like that. He could be as quiet as a mouse until he transformed into a lion and stabbed us all to death out there in the woods. The trees slid by in the soupy glass of Clyde's windshield, and as we came to the cul-de-sac at the end of the access road, Clyde slowed down and stopped in the middle. The area was open, carved out and rolled smooth as they prepared to raise new houses here. At the moment, the pristine land just looked barren and lonely, and Clyde looked back at Steve to make sure this was the place. "It's in the woods behind this. Come on," he said, looking at his 2 bookends to see who would get out first. As it happened, Tobias climbed out first, and Steve followed him as Clyde turned off the Jeep and killed the headlights. It was dark, the moon little more than a silvery thought, but luckily Clyde had some flashlights in the back. Steve had his own headlamp in his back pocket, and as we dug out the lights, he slid it on and waited for us to get ready. Margot had sobered up a little and was complaining about how she didn't want to go tromping out into the woods at night. We debated just leaving her there, but as Clyde slid an arm around her, she perked up and prepared to walk into the trees with him. Margot had a pretty obvious crush on Clyde, but she seemed the only one who hadn't guessed that Tobias would be more up Steve's alley. The only one who might have been more surprised to learn that was Clyde himself. Steve headed off into the woods as we checked our lights, his headlamp bobbing between the scrubby trees surrounded by flat and unnatural landscape. He called back to us, telling us to get the lead out if we wanted to see it, and we came along with our flashlights bobbing and Margot swaying as Clyde tried manfully to keep her upright. The night sounds around us seemed way louder than they had been in the city. The crickets chirped and reed happily. The bats tittered and flapped overhead. The frogs sounded off in the depths of the woods, and as the wind rustled, it sounded like the trees themselves were welcoming us. The leaves of last year rattled skeletally on the branches as they chimed in the winter, and the deeper we went, the more lonely the place seemed. It felt like we had entered the graveyard long before I saw the crumbling stone and iron walls that surrounded it. "Welcome to Habersham Cemetery," Steve said grandly. "Here lies the entirety of the Habersham line, save for the last 2 generations who are buried in Mount Christos. I've spent some of the best times of my life here, times I'll never recapture again." He checked his watch and beckoned us inside. Someone had set up a couch under the overhang of trees, and I had a sneaking suspicion I knew who it was. Margot flopped onto the old couch, sending up a cloud of dust and dead leaves, and Tobias sat gingerly beside her as he tested the old couch for bugs or rats. Clyde leaned against a gravestone, and Kat hopped up on a stone marker that was as big as a coffee table. Steve was looking out towards the middle, an area without markers that seemed marred by a few hasty little hillocks. I wondered again if this was the place he meant to kill us, maybe bury us in this long-forgotten graveyard. I doubted it, but it was a thought that wouldn't quite leave. I pushed it aside and went to stand near him, curious about why he had us all here in the first place. "Your van didn't really get towed, did it?" I asked. I expected he would lie, but he surprised me with his candor. "I wasn't as smooth with that one as I thought, was I?" "No, truth is, I usually ask someone to take me out here. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a stranger, and sometimes I just end up walking. Make no mistake, though, I end up at this cemetery before midnight every year." "And how many Halloweens has that been?" He seemed to consider, but I didn't think he really had to think too hard about it. "About 11. I think maybe this one might be number 12. "And why is this so important that you walk here every Halloween?" I had gotten past the idea that he meant to kill us, but I was still curious about the locale and the reason for coming here. Surely we weren't going to see corpses dance out here. "Well, I think I got time for a story. You see, I used to come out here when I was in middle school with my friends. Davy had found the place, and when he showed Heather, Mark, and I, we thought it was about the coolest place ever. We brought Sandra out here when she and Mark met in high school. By that point, it was our regular hangout spot. We used to come out here every Halloween and tell scary stories and eat candy, drink beer, just relax, you know. I had my first time on that grave marker your friend's sitting on, and afterwards I looked at Heather and knew that she was the only girl I ever wanted to be with." He looked wistfully at the old hillocks, and I realized that there were 4 of them out there. The thought piqued my curiosity, but it also rekindled a little of my mistrust. "Then one night, I messed it all up." An alarm went off on his watch, and he looked down as he wrung his hands. "Any minute now." He watched the mounds in the middle of the boneyard, continuing his story as he waited for the show to begin. "We were coming back from a show one night, all of us drunk or stoned or some combination of the two. A deer ran out in front of my van, and I swerved to miss it. The van skidded, and I went off into the ravine. It wasn't very deep, but I think I was the only one wearing a seatbelt. My friends bounced around in the van like popcorn. When we came to rest at the bottom, I slipped off for a while. When I came to, 3 of them were already dead. I sometimes wish that Heather had been one of them, but it did mean that I got to say goodbye." I heard something rustle out in the graveyard and looked at the 4 mounds that Steve was marking so attentively. "I had a burn on the side of my face from something. I was never quite sure what, but it was bad enough that I'd never forget it. As bad as it was, though, Heather was worse. She was beaten all to hell, laying on what would have been the ceiling and pulling in breath like she had broken ribs and they were in her lungs. She was looking at me, and when I saw her, I unclipped my seatbelt and fell to my knees beside her. Despite her protest, I pulled her onto my lap, and as she lay dying in my arms, I could hear her whispering something again and again. I leaned in close, just as the blue and white lights reflected inside the van, as she whispered her request one final time before passing on." I hardly heard him as he laid it all out. The earth around the mounds had begun to shift, the earth running in rivulets. A dark finger had wormed its way from the closest grave, and an arm was inching out to join it. The top of a head appeared from the ground, and the blonde hair was ragged like old yarn. Steve grinned as he looked at the face below the hair, sniffling a little as she pulled herself free. revealing a corpse in a black dress. The other 3 wore formal wear, suits or dresses that looked like they'd never seen more than a week above ground. I took a step away, feeling like someone stuck in a George Romero film as I watched them shuffle out like sleepwalkers. "What in the hell?" I asked, and I heard Kat squeak in uncharacteristic fear as she nearly tumbled off the marker stone. Clyde had taken a step towards me, Margot clutching at his arm as she screamed like a fire alarm. Clyde was clutching at something as Margot clutched at him, and I could see that it was a jagged piece of gravestone. Steve stepped in front of him, waving his arms as he begged for him not to hurt them. "They won't hurt anybody. They've never hurt anybody. Just watch." As if they had only been waiting for him to speak, all 4 took up poses and began to rotate in a slow circle. They moved to a tune that only they could hear, and they turned and moved like dancers caught in a familiar bit of choreography. They were helpless, moved by something unearthly, and their dance had turned into something grotesque as I noticed their injuries. Their clothes hid the bones that must be poking through their skin, but I could clearly see that one of the boys, a big blonde one with football player shoulders, had a broken leg that he was dancing on heedlessly. One of the girls had a head that looked mushy, and the one that I had first seen come out of the ground had a bob to her neck that made it seem like it no longer wanted to support her. The 4 moved with graceless precision, spinning as they moved in a circle, grasping hands as they came together in the center. "What the hell is this?" Tobias asked, sounding angry as he got off the couch and walked towards Steve. "Dancing corpses, just as I told you." "Yeah, but we didn't expect to actually see them. We thought, Clyde stammered. "Thought what? That I was putting you on? That I was messing with a group of kids? That I meant to drag you out here so I could kill you or rob you? Then why did you come out here at all? Why would you come out here with a complete stranger if you didn't believe what I was saying?" We couldn't really argue with that. He was right. We'd gone into the woods with a perfect stranger. And for what? Had any of us really believed that we would see dancing corpses? We knew that such things didn't really happen, but here we were, watching 4 rotting corpses dance like tired ballet performers. Clyde went back to the couch, Margot clutching his arm, and we all sat in rapture as we watched their performance. As they turned and moved, I could see that Steve had eyes only for the blonde with the broken neck. He followed her as she spun, smiling whenever her eyes happened upon his. It was hard not to imagine that her rotten lips twisted a little in pleasure, and I felt like I already knew who she was before I asked. "Heather?" I asked, but he put a hand up to stop me. After the dance is over. I'll finish the story then, but for now, just let me watch." I nodded and turned back to see the corpses leaping like deer, their legs groaning in agony as their bones tried to hold them up. Suddenly there were others in the old boneyard, alabaster spirits, their bodies too decomposed to rise and dance, spun around the shambling dancers. Their movements were expert, their bright leotards and costumes from 1,000 different performances, and they complemented the dancing bodies expertly. The dance was one they knew, a dance they had all danced for generations, and as his watch beeped again, all the dancers suddenly stopped and turned to look at us. It was strange having the eyes of the living dead on you, and as they all bowed politely, the ghosts dissipated in a shower of stars. The 4 corpses, however, simply fell to the ground and moved no more. "Shame it only lasts 15 minutes, Steve sighed. "Okay, I waited till the end of the dance. Now, how about you fill me in on the rest?" I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Sure, but first I need to put my old friends back to bed." He went into the woods and came back with 4 shovels. "It'll go faster if you help me, but I understand if you'd rather not." I took the offered shovel, and Clyde reached for one as well. Tobias took some coaxing, but he finally grabbed the other when Catherine sighed and went to take it. Margot just sat on the couch, her eyes closed and her breathing gentle. Clyde told us that it had all been a little too much for her, and he'd watched her faint just as the dead people started to dance. Kat came over to help us anyway, and as we worked, Steve finished his story, bringing the others to speed before continuing. "Heather said she wanted to be buried here, but it wasn't the first time she'd asked it. We were in the graveyard on the last Halloween of her life, watching the ghosts dance and twirl when she asked me to bury her here when she died. I looked at her oddly, asking why she would want to be buried here, and she told me that she liked the idea of dancing with all the ghosts once a year. Coming back once a year to dance with all my friends sounds like a wonderful way to spend my death. The others must have heard her because they decided they wanted to be buried here too. By the end of the night, all of us had made a pact. We would all make sure that we were buried here, the last one alive making sure that the rest were buried here, one way or another. He rubbed the sweat off his forehead, climbing out of the hole as he prepared to put his friend back in it. None of them thought they'd have to make good on that pact less than a year later. No teenager who's barely in their senior year thinks about their death as more than a distant idea. And suddenly it fell to me to make sure their wishes were honored. Their parents wouldn't hear a word I had to say. They blamed me for their children's death. I was drunk when we crashed after all, and I was barred from their funerals. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that if I ever wanted to see Heather again, I would need to fulfill my promise to them. "You didn't," I said, kind of wishing I hadn't asked. Fortunately, they were buried in 2 different cemeteries. If I'd spent 12 hours in one, someone would have likely caught me for sure. Heather came first, then Mark. Then I got Davy and Sandra from the Presbyterian church, just as the sun came up. I had borrowed my dad's old truck and parked right around where your friend parked his Jeep. I brought them out here one at a time and buried them in the place they loved so much. I put them to rest where I knew they could rest easy, and when it was all done, I washed the evidence out of my dad's truck and parked it right where he had left it. The police came to question me, of course, but I was careful not to let anyone see me enter or leave the cemetery, or leave any evidence behind. In the end, they had to let me go, and I marked the days until Halloween. He lifted Heather into his arms, looking at her rotting face with love. The first time I saw her dance, I was nearly scared shitless. I was out here drinking, keeping up the traditions that we had always held, but I don't think I actually thought they would dance. They weren't Habershams, and I would see nothing but the usual spooks as they capered. When they all drugged themselves up, I spilled my beer and thought they'd come to get me for disturbing their graves. When they began to dance, though, I was so happy. I felt that happiness falter, though, when I realized what it meant. He laid her in the ground again, and as he began to cover her with soil, he looked back with the saddest smile I'd ever seen. It meant that there was no one to lay me to rest in the cemetery when my time comes. I'll never dance with her, never be with her again, unless I have the courage to bury myself alive when the time comes. We were all gathered around the last grave, all of us besides Margot, and as he came out of the hole, he thanked us for helping him. Normally I'd offer you a beer, but I'm afraid I forgot to buy any this time. Clyde told him he thought it might be time for him to take Margot home, and Tobias said he needed to get home for chores the next day. Clyde had Margot over one shoulder, still snoring happily, and I saw Kat slide her hand into Tobias's as they left. I asked Steve if he needed a ride, but he just shook his head and leaned on his shovel. I think I'll stay for a little while. I prefer to spend Halloween with my friends, and I think we've got some catching up to do. We saw Steve a few more times over the years, and unfortunately his predictions had been true. Tobias and Catherine dated until college, when they both got accepted into separate schools. Clyde and Margot were an item for a while, mostly to get his strictly religious parents off his back, until he finally came out and moved to the Midwest somewhere with his secret boyfriend. I got tired of being used as a shoulder to cry on by Margot, and decided to go to college in the next state. I kept in touch with all of them, but we were never together again the way we were in high school. 10 years after I'd seen the dancing ghosts, I happened to be home for Halloween. I decided it might be nice to see them again. Maybe I wanted to prove that I'd actually seen it the first time. Maybe I just wanted to make sure the old place was still there. Maybe I just wanted to see Steve again. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling up into the cul-de-sac about 11 o'clock that night, locking my car and walking into the woods. The area had grown back up. The lots had been cleared and never used. I had thought it might be hard to find a second time, but the trees looked exactly the same as I remembered them. When the gates loomed up, I saw they hadn't changed either, and I could already see the sagging old couch as it sat beside the fence. I expected that Steve would come wandering up at any minute, but as the time ticked closer to midnight, I figured this would be one performance he would miss. As I sat on the couch, my watch chimed midnight, and the earth began to stir. The original 4 corpses were still there, but they were mostly skeletons now. Their bones were broken and cracked, but they still danced as they had on that night a decade ago. They groaned and creaked as they danced and spun, but the corpse who crawled out of Heather's grave looked a little fresher. He was wearing the same black vest I'd seen him in that night, and though dirty, I could still make out some of the band patches. The ghosts joined them, and I marveled once again at the intricate dance they moved within. I didn't know how long he had been there, but it appeared that Steve had found the courage he was talking about to chase the woman he loved. When they flopped to the ground, I got up and found the shovels again. It appeared they would need someone else to lay them to rest this year. I wondered who would put them in the ground next year, or whether they would simply bake in the sun the day after their performance. I think maybe that was when I decided it was time to move back home. I could do worse than teach English in my old high school, drink coffee at the old coffee shop, and watch the corpses dance on Halloween. Who knows, maybe I'll even find some teenagers to invite out here one night, so they can have something to remember when their high school days are behind them. Maybe they too will come back to see one last performance by the Habersham dancers, +5.
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. If you enjoy the channel, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. Maybe leave a comment too if you feel so inclined. Me, and of course the algorithm, always like when you interact. How about another video? I'm sure you could be down for that. Why not click on one of the videos above and get a little more spooky today? If you'd be interested in getting a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. There's also a link to my Reddit page where you can read some of my other stories that I've put out. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our wonderful patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Leslie Lou Riddle, Martha, and Marianne Schuler for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks to you all. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the show, then I always recommend you come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can take advantage of all the wonderful things we do there. There's all kinds of unique content that you only get if you're part of my Patreon, so come on down and see what all the fuss is about. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.